Hey y'all, so this is your article for this week. It's called Should Voting Be Mandatory in the US? And today I am just going to be reading the article and you will be annotating yourself. So after every paragraph, I'm going to stop and say you can pause here to annotate, and that is when you will annotate that paragraph. So notice on the side I wrote a key for myself, and it'll be helpful for y'all too. So you're going to use these when annotating. So if you have a question, you'll put a question mark and then write in your question next to it. If you found something interesting, you'll put an exclamation point and put what you found interesting. And then if you just have a comment to make, you'll put an asterisk or a little star and then write your comment. This is just how I would do it. You can do it however you want, but remember, everything that you underline or circle or highlight or bracket, whatever, needs to have a note next to it. If you just turn in your article that's just underlined and circled and highlighted with no words, you will be getting a 0. Okay, every thing you underline should have a note next to it. Remember that. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading, and then I will tell you when to stop and annotate. Picking a president is one of the most important responsibilities a U.S. citizen can have. But if the past is any guide, tens of millions of Americans won't be voting this fall. In the 2016 presidential election, only 59% of eligible voters cast ballots. Turnout for the 2018 midterm elections was even lower, about 49%. That was the highest eligible voter turnout for midterms since 1914. Still, having so few eligible voters participate in elections is a major problem, experts say. After all, voting is one of the main ways citizens can voice their approval or disapproval of elected officials. That's why many people say the U.S. should follow the lead of more than 20 countries, including Australia, Peru, and Singapore, and make voting mandatory. Doing so would ensure that Americans' voices are heard, supporters say. But many other people argue that while voting is important, Americans should vote because they want to, not because they have to. Instead of making voting mandatory, they argue the U.S. should focus on making it easier for people to vote in the first place and on helping them understand why voting matters. Should voting be mandatory in the U.S.? 2 experts weigh in. So now take the time to annotate that section. You can pause this video. If you're on Zoom, I'll pause it now. So now for the yes or no sides. So to help y'all out, at the bottom of each section, you will see the author of each of those sides. So the yes column is written by Lisa Hill. So remember, in your in your essay, if you cite from this side of the article, you're going to cite Hill as your author. And then if you take the side of no, then you will cite Brennan as your author when you pull text evidence. So let's start with the yes. Everyone should be required by law to vote. Democracy doesn't work if a large portion of the population doesn't participate. Mandatory voting is the best way to get politicians to focus their attention on all Americans. Wealthier people are more likely to vote, so government policies are often geared toward their interests. In general, the people who don't vote are the ones being left behind. People who are unemployed, poor, or less educated. I'm going to stop now for you to annotate that section if you need to. And now continuing on. If voting were mandatory in the U.S., citizens would be inspired to pay more attention to campaigns and current events, and candidates would be able to spend less time and money on getting voters to the polls and more on explaining where they stand on key issues. Australia has had mandatory voting for federal elections since 1924. People who don't cast ballots have to pay a fine of about $20. As a result, about 90% of eligible voters turn out. Perhaps because more people are involved in choosing their representatives, Australians tend to report much higher levels of trust in government than Americans do. By comparison, a recent Pew Research Center survey found that just 17% of Americans trust the federal government. Voting is more than a right. It's a responsibility. If Americans want a government that's truly of the people, by the people, and for the people, everyone has to vote. Okay, so now we're going to read the no section. So go ahead and I'm going to pause it now for you to annotate the last bit of the yes section. So now for the no section. The government shouldn't force people to vote. Doing so would flood the polls with millions of uninformed voters. Some Americans know a lot about politics and current events, others know very little. Requiring uninformed people to vote would be like forcing them to fly an airplane without training. Elections have high stakes. Our votes help influence matters of war and peace, poverty and prosperity, justice and injustice, not just in the U.S., but worldwide. Bad decisions at the polls can result in devastating wars, damaging laws, and disastrous economic policies. So I'm going to go ahead and pause it here for you to annotate those first few paragraphs. Some people argue that voting is a civic duty. In my view, Americans who choose not to vote can exercise their civic duties in other ways, such as volunteering in their communities. Those who do vote owe it to themselves and others to be informed about the issues on the ballot. Besides, having the right to do something doesn't mean you should have to do it. For instance, we have the right to write novels or do science experiments, but if the government forced us to do those things, it would violate our individual freedom. Why should voting be any different? So go ahead and take time to annotate those paragraphs. There are way better ways to fix low voter turnout. For example, we could make it easier for people to register to vote. We could keep the polls open later or have election day on weekends instead of Tuesdays. Such changes would be more effective and democratic than forcing people to vote whether they want to or not. Okay, so that is your article. So remember, you should have it fully annotated before you turn it in, not just underlining and highlighting, but having notes and interacting with the text. That's the biggest thing. So once you're completely done annotating, you will turn it in, and that is all that you need to do for today.